welcome back. Um, I hope you enjoyed the break, had some time to stretch your legs, freshen up, get some coffee or something else. Thank you for joining me again. Um, what we finished up with, what we ended with just before the break was me demonstrating to you how to run the tests on for both consumers. And those tests, A, test the implementation of the consumer parties themselves, and B, generate the contracts that contain the expectations that the consumers have about how the provider behaves. Um, what I had to rush through just a little bit at the end, but that's because we are very strict on time, and that's a good thing. So I'm just going to briefly repeat that. The final step we performed just before the break is copying those contracts generated by the consumers to the address provider in a specific folder, in this case, source test pacts, which is also the source folder we see here, and then run the test on the provider side to see if the current provider implementation matches is able to match the expectations, to meet the expectations expressed in those contracts. And as you can see, and if I run my tests on the provider side, I see the 10 tests are run, and you've probably guessed from this nice green color here and the fact that Maven says that the build has been a success, that all of these tests have passed, which means that the current implementation of the provider is able to meet the expectations both for the customer consumer as well as for the order consumer. That's not that much of a surprise. First of all, I've written this code and I've tested it before, so that's not really that. Plus, the expectations for both the customer consumer and the order consumer are actually exactly the same right now. So yes, there are two different contracts, but the expectations that both parties have is exactly the same. So that's in short how the contract testing process goes. The consumer side defines expectations in code using Pact. It uses unit tests to generate the contract. Those contracts are distributed, in this case, just copied to distributed to the provider, to the address provider in this case. And the address provider can use those contracts, the expectations, to check if its current implementation meets all of the expectations. This is a workshop, which means there's work for you to do too. I want to give you 5 minutes to repeat this process for yourself, just to get some familiarity with the consumer-driven testing process in Pact. So that's basically executing these 4 steps that I've written down here on screen, as is basically exactly copying what I did just before the break. Run the tests for both consumers using MVN clean test, Maven clean test. Copy the contracts for both consumers, again, which is something I did not show in the slide, but when these contracts are generated, they are, that's the address provider. And for the consumers, they end up in a Pacts subfolder in the target folder. Copy those to source test pacts on for the provider. You can override them because the um, if you checked the project out from GitHub, there were some contracts in there already. Then run the tests for the provider, again using mvn clean test, and check that the test pass. So basically, check for yourself that you get the exact same output as I've shown just before the break. So I'm giving you 5 minutes for that. So until 40 past, I think 7 in your time zone. And after that, what I'll be doing is maybe not for this one, because that would just be repeating the exact same thing as I've done just before the break. After that, I'm going to introduce a small change, which I'm then going to ask you to implement and see what effect that has on our consumer-driven contract testing results. But for now, just take a couple of minutes to try and repeat what I've done, just to go through the process yourself, familiarize yourself with the code a little, with the structure, and see how it works. All right, time's up. I know 5 minutes is really short, but I've got two more of these small exercises coming up, and there's some other information that I'd like to give you about the process of consumer-driven contract testing. So, unfortunately, this is all the time that I can give you. Of course, you'll have a recording of this workshop. You'll have the slides. The code that I'm using for this workshop will be online long after this workshop is over. So if there's not enough time right now for you to complete the exercises, you can always continue or try again at a later point in time. And I'm probably going to repeat this at the end, but if at any point you have a question or a technical issue or something else that you want to ask that you didn't think of or so in the Q&A, just send me an email. My email address is on the first and last slide of the slide deck. So, and I'm more than happy to help you out there. So this is the situation as is. So we've got two consumers, both consuming the same provider. They both express their expectations in a contract, pass those contracts to the provider, and the provider is able to meet those expectations, which means all is well, everybody's happy, sunshine, rainbows, unicorns, you name it. Unfortunately, the world is ever, things change. The only constant is change, I've read somewhere. So at some point, things will lie. It's not really likely that the situation will stay as rosy with everything green as it is right now. Let's look at a change request. And I'm going to show you actually now I'm just for the next cycle, the next small exercise that I'm going to give you, I'm going to ask you to implement a really simple change in the code and check what effect that has on in the contract testing process. So let me introduce that change to you very quickly. Let's assume now that the consumer wants to implement a change. Let's close these ones quickly. And the change they want to implement is that they no longer expect an HTTP 204, which is actually a very sensible and reasonable HTTP status code to return in case of a delete. The 204 corresponds to no content, so which is sort of kind of a confirmation from the provider side that the content is actually deleted. So there's no more content for this specific endpoint, this specific piece of data. What I wanted you to change just for the customer consumer is the expectation that this 204. So I want you to update the specifications in code to reflect that in case we do an HTTP delete for a correctly formatted address ID, that it does no longer expect an HTTP 204, but a regular HTTP 200. So what I want you to do is, as it says here. So my next question, your next task, so to say, in this workshop is change the customer consumer tests so that they expect an HTTP 200 instead of a 204 when an address is successfully deleted. Run the tests for both consumers again using Maven clean test. Check that the new expectation is written to the contract, just that to make sure that your new expectation for the customer consumer is actually written to the contract. Copy that contract again, give that the updated contracts again to the provider, and run the test on the provider side again. See what happens. And I sort of kind of gave it away here. So spoiler alert in the last bullet. One test will fail. And I'd like you to inspect the feedback. Again, I'm going to give you, say, 4 or 5 minutes for this. After that, I'm going to show you on screen and explain to you what you just saw, or in case you didn't get it to work or didn't manage to finish this in time, what you should have been seeing. All right, time's up again. So let's just go through this together on screen. Again, so what the expectation that I want to change is that the customer consumer, in case it wants to send an HTTP delete for a correctly formatted address ID, it no longer expects a 204 but a 200. This is literally the only change you need to do in the code. If we then run the tests again for the customer consumer, I'm not going to bother with running the test again for the order consumer, by the way, because its implementation, its expectations stay exactly the same. So, yeah, we'd be wasting our time. That it's the contract will not change for the order consumer. For the customer consumer, however, if we take a closer look at the generated contract, we'll now see, oops, of course, the wrong one. In case the address ID is correctly formatted, it expects an HTTP 200, where the order consumer expects a 204. So this is a conflict because the state, the operation is exactly the same, but the provider cannot both return a 200 and a 204. So if I distribute this, I give this new contract to the provider and run the tests again. So again, I'm now checking if the provider is able to meet all of the expectations for both the customer consumer as well as the order consumer. So again, that takes a couple of seconds because it's actually starting up an in-memory API here. And you can see already from these nice red error messages that something went wrong here. Because now, again, we have 10 tests. So those are these 10 states, these 10 tests actually on the provider side. But unfortunately, not all of them passed. And Pact's actually so kind as to say, well, there's a failure there. In case a request to delete an address has status code 200, there was for one of the consumers, in one of the contracts, one of the contracts contained an expectation that I could not meet because if you look a little closer at the actual implementation, and this is something you can forget immediately again. For the delete, the response status is an HTTP no content, which corresponds to an HTTP 204. So if I would change this to OK and then run the test again, I'd have the same problem, only now because it can no longer meet the expectations of the order consumer, because that consumer still expects an HTTP 204 and not an HTTP 200. So and this is the first type, and again, status code is basically a hello world of contract testing, but it gives you some insight into the types of defects that can be uncovered by contract testing. So a mismatch in expectations between different consumers. Right. Let's change this back to 204 so all is well again. I've got another one for you. And that one has to do with not with the delete, but with the get. As I explained before the break, there are a number of different matching methods, and these matchers, these methods, you can use them. They are provided by Pact, and you can use them to express expectations about the structure of your response body. And so what you're seeing here are three different examples of these dslMatchers. So there's one that expresses, well, the response body should contain an element with a value that is a UUID. So it should be a string, and the format of that string should be 8 characters, 4, 4, 4, 12. And all characters should either be 0 through 9 or A through F. So it's hexadecimal characters. So that's UUID. As strings as well, I'm expecting a field with a specific name, and its value should be a string. The same for integer. Now, there are lots more useful things with booleans, for example, with dates in specific formats, and so on. Again, I can also express that I want an element to have a specific value here. That's a little strict. But another thing that I can do is if I want to be a little stricter than just accepting any string, but I don't want to, or I can't be so specific that I'm expecting a specific value. One thing that I can do is requiring that the value returned by the provider, so that's included in the response, matches a specific regular expression. And so that allows me to, first of all, regular expressions are extremely powerful, so you can run really wild with those. But that gives you a lot of options to be more strict about what the value that you expect looks like. And that's my next exercise for you. So let's look at the state field. So currently, again, this is for the customer consumer. Actually, it doesn't really matter which one you take here. You can do it for one of them. You can do it for both if you want to, but one of them is definitely enough. This state field can now just accept any string. But maybe that's not strict enough for my customer consumer. I want this state field to be a string, but I'm only allowing specific values here. You can't do that with a string type matcher because that accepts any string value, really. As long as it's a string, it's okay. There is, however, a different matcher called a string matcher. And this string matcher method, that's the one you can use. Again, you see it here. This is, it takes 3 arguments. The first one is the name of the element in the response body that you expect. The second one is a regular expression, which the actual value provided, returned by the provider, should match. And the third one, again, is the example, which is used to populate the mocks. So what I'm not just going to give it away. That's for afterwards. Um, but what I want you to do now is again undo your change from the previous exercise first. So change that 204 or that 200 back to 204, just to make sure you've got a clean slate again, so to say. And then change the customer consumer test so that the value for the state field can only be either Oklahoma or California. And for those of you who've never really written regular expressions, I can't blame you. They're interesting and very powerful, but also very specific. The regular expression you're looking for is Oklahoma, California, separated by a pipe, enclosed in brackets, so just round brackets. So that's the value for the regular expression. Again, run the tests for both consumers, or in this case, just the customer consumer is okay too, by the way. Check that the new expectation is written to the contract and see what that looks like. Distribute the contract to the provider again and see what happens. Again, 5 minutes, 4 or 5 minutes. And after that, I'll show you on screen what I expect you to see for yourself. unfortunately, time's up. So let's have a look. As I said, I don't want to just accept any state value for the state field anymore. Instead, what I want to do is specify a regular expression which only accepts values of Oklahoma and California. So, and this string matcher method does exactly that. What it says here is I'm expecting an element in the response body called state, and its value should A, be a string, and B, match this regular expression. So if I run the test, and here, by the way, IntelliJ is really helpful in telling me this should be the name, this should be the regular expression, and this is the example. Oh, I forgot one thing. This test is going to fail. Yeah, because this value I should use here to populate the example should also match this regular expression. Much better. Passing tests. So if I look at the latest version of the contract, this is not what I'm looking for. Yay, this is the one I'm looking for. If I scroll down here, I can actually see this ID. This is the one that the ID, that's the one that matches this, that's generated by this UUID method. The way that ends up in the contract is also a regular expression matcher, and here's actually the regular expression for a UUID. But what I also have here now for the state is I don't have a type matcher anymore, but also a regular expression matcher with the regular expression that I expect here. So let's give this latest version of the contract to our address provider again and run its tests. And as you can probably predict what happens by now. I've got there's a reason I chose Oklahoma and California, because I know what the actual address API returns, and it's not Oklahoma or California. So, and you can see it here clearly in the error message. I expected the actual value that's being returned, because that's Tennessee, to match this regular expression. So it should be either Oklahoma or California, which it's not. If we look at there we go. So this is my actual implementation of the address API. It's the most unintelligent address API ever, probably, because it no matter what you send it, as long as it's valid, this is the data that it returns. So if I change this to Oklahoma, so it changed its implementation to always return Oklahoma. And see, well, now I've updated my implementation. And so there's been a mismatch in expectation. So one of the consumers expects something that I cannot, and as an expectation that I cannot fulfill. So now I've changed the actual implementation of my provider API. And as by magic, it now passes again. Why does it pass now? Because the consumer is satisfied because the value that's being returned is either Oklahoma or California. And this doesn't change anything for the expectations for the order consumer, because if we go back to the expectations defined there, that one still doesn't really care what the value of this state field is as long as it's a string. So now my current address service implementation is able to match both expectations again. So wrapping up, this is so now you've seen the kinds of defects that contract testing can find. So they are not defects in the implementation of the provider per se, but they are defects or potential conflicts. It's probably a better word for it, in the integration between consumer and provider. And a big benefit, again, this is something that I expressed earlier before the break too. Is with contract testing is an asynchronous process. So you have a single source of truth, the contract, but and while I've now run the tests for the consumer and the provider within 2 minutes or a minute of each other, and that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. So, and even with this demo, at no point did the consumer and the provider have to be running at the same time, which is true in traditional integration and end-to-end testing. So there's a lot of first of all, these tests are much faster than traditional large-scale end-to-end testing. And they can run asynchronously. So the consumers can generate the contracts as part of their build cycles and deployment cycles, test cycles. And the same goes for the providers. Copying the contracts, as you've seen, as we've done, as I've demonstrated it so far. And by the way, this was the last exercise, so you can all sit back and relax. You've survived this. I'm just going to explain a little bit more about the Pact ecosystem and give you some resources for further reading or watching. And then it's on to the Q&A. Copying the contracts, as we've done in this demo, in this workshop, is manual labor and therefore less than ideal because it's error prone, it's inefficient, it's not something that can be automated, and we like to automate things if possible. This is where the Pact broker comes in. The Pact broker is a platform or a system, or maybe the best way to describe it is a repository. It's a central library or a repository for contracts. It stores and versions and automatically distributes contracts between consumers and providers. And a Pact broker is also able to store contract verification results. So the test results on the provider side can also be uploaded back to the broker, which can then be used either by the consumer or the provider to check, is everything okay before I deploy the latest version of my component to production. So the way this works, briefly, this mechanism works. So we have a consumer and a provider with the Pact broker in between. The consumer generates the contract, which is what we've seen. But instead of manually copying and pasting it to somewhere else, you publish it to the broker. And that can all be automated, again, using Maven plugins or via REST API calls. The provider can, via the same mechanism, download the contract and verify compliance. Pact actually has a nice annotation for that. In the example code that we saw, I used the Pact folder annotation. There's also a Pact broker annotation, which you can use to point to a specific web address for a Pact broker. The API provider can then publish its verification results, as I said, can show to the consumers, to the world, well, I'm able to meet all of your all of your expectations, or there's a problem with the specific expectation that I have. And both consumers and providers can then check those verification results and use those verification results to determine whether or not it's safe to deploy a new version into production. All fully automated. So this is where a Pact broker is extremely useful to automate and manage and version and distribute the entire process, really. There are two types of Pact brokers, or two different versions of this Pact broker. You have pactflow.io, which is a cloud solution. The first thing I'm going to say here is it's not free, it's paid for. There is a free plan, which is quite generous, but it is a paid solution. So that's the first thing I'm going to say. What you do get is a broker that's, you don't need to manage it, you don't need to run it yourself. And it has this nice looking graphical user interface, which gives you insight into the current status for all of the contracts that you're managing. If you don't want to use Pactflow, you can also host a Pact broker yourself. That's available as a Docker image. So you can run a Pact broker inside your own network as well. If security or things like that are issues to you, or you want to run things yourself instead of having it running in the cloud somewhere. And that Pact broker is absolutely free to use. So Pactflow is paid for, but the Dockerized Pact broker, which is also available, is absolutely free. And you can do a lot of the same things that you can do with the cloud solution with that Docker version as well. To wrap this up, now that we've seen what consumer-driven contract testing does do well, let's look at a couple of things that it does not do so well. It's not something I'd use for testing implementation details of a provider. First of all, that's the responsibility of the provider itself, not something that should be managed between consumer and provider. A Pact's not, or consumer-driven contract testing is not the right technique for this. You should just use an API client like Postman, or a library like Rest Assured or Requests for Python, or whatever you want to use to write tests that verify the implementation of the provider itself. It's also not really well suited for testing public APIs. First of all, for public APIs, you don't really know who your consumers are, because it's a public API. So it's probably really hard to have that discussion of let's implement consumer-driven contract testing. But also because public APIs tend to have a lot of different consumers, which if you'd have to fulfill all of the contracts for all of these consumers, that would get really annoying really quickly. So it doesn't work really well for public APIs. If you want to read a little more, this is a great blog post, Getting Started, What is Pact Good For? That's written by the people behind Pact itself, that explain in much more detail what they think their product, their service, their library should be used for, and is not as well suited to do. To wrap up, I've got a couple of useful resources for you. What I think are useful resources, really. First of all, again, I can't recommend the Pact documentation enough. It's really extensive. It's well written, and there are lots of examples there. Links to the GitHub repositories for all of the bindings with example projects. It's a treasure trove of information, really. The people behind, if you're more of a video watcher than a documentation reader, the people behind Pact also created a video series, a 4-part video series. So you have the slides, so you'll have all of the links. In the first video, they explain why they came up with contract testing, what challenges in end-to-end testing they tried to address with Pact. The second one is a demo of contract testing, how Pact works. They use the JavaScript bindings for Pact to demonstrate that. But again, the concept is the same. So I've used Java, they use JavaScript in that video. But no matter if you use Java or JavaScript or the C# bindings or the Python bindings, the syntax is a little bit different from one language to the next, but the concept is exactly the same for each of these bindings. So actually the third one is the demo with Pact JavaScript. I'm sorry. So the second one is an explanation of contract testing and how Pact itself works. And the fourth one is a reminder or as some motivation about how these contract tests, how consumer-driven contract testing replaces a lot of the end-to-end testing that a lot of teams and organizations still do. This is a link to my self-promotion alert. This is a link to my own blog. I'm in the process of writing a 6-part article series based on that uses the same code as you've seen in this workshop. And it takes you through the entire process. So this is a link to the first article, and that contains links to the other ones as well. I've written the first 4. I still have to find the time to write the other 2, but they will be there. Hopefully, it won't take me too long. But this is basically the written down story behind what you've seen today. And finally, so this link was in the instructions as well, but all of the code that you've seen, the code base, the project, is available on GitHub, on my GitHub page. Introduction to Contract Testing is the name of the repository. It'll probably be online for a while because I'm using this repository to store the code that I'm using in the blog post series that I mentioned in the previous slide as well. So it'll probably be available if you want to have a play around with the code that you've seen in this workshop, this is where you can find it, and it'll probably be online for a while. That's it from me. Mikhail, how are we doing with questions? Are there any questions?
Yeah, we have some, and I hope we'll have a couple more. Let's start with a question that were asked even in the beginning of your first time slot. Yeah. So, what can we do if relationship is many to many? It's about relationship of different microservices. When different microservices use the same API, so it's impossible to set single contract at one.
That is a good question. So, first of all, sorry for having you wait so long to address your question. So, first of all, a many-to-many relationship between consumers and providers. So, a contract is an agreement between one consumer and one provider. If you have two consumers that each consume two providers, you get 4 contracts. So if you have consumer A and consumer B, and provider A and provider B, there's a contract between consumer A and provider A, between consumer A and provider B, between consumer B and provider A, and between consumer B and provider B. So that doesn't really change if there's a many-to-many relationship. The example that I've shown and that I've used in this workshop is a many-to-one relationship, but it doesn't really change if there's a many-to-many relationship. The concept doesn't really change.
So the concept the same, just difference in realization, right?
A difference in volume, mainly, yeah. But so what a contract is a list of interactions, and an interaction, and it's basically you can compare that to an API call, and that's always made from one consumer to one provider. So that doesn't really change no matter how many consumers and how many providers you have, unless you have a fundamentally different kind of architecture, and then I'd have to look it up. But then I also need some more details.
Right. So Sergey, if you can share some details for us, probably we can address this question in more much more.
Yes.
In some details.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, please. So if this doesn't answer your question, please let me know. Then I probably didn't understand your question well enough.
Yeah. And next question is from Ivan. He was quite active while the workshop, and he is asking how to set order for creating contracts before testing it in producer test case.
I'm not sure I understand that question.
Okay, if I understood it correctly, so the question is how to set up an order for testing. Is there any way to run the test in some specified order or not?
It shouldn't have to matter, really. The only order that's really relevant here is that the customer first runs their test to generate the contracts and publishes those, and only then can the provider verify them, because there's nothing to verify if there's no contract. But the order in which the different segments, the different interactions in a contract are generated doesn't really matter.
Ivan clarified his question. So it's how to set up the order for a test for consumers before and then go to producers.
So in this example, they are just because it's more convenient and easier to switch from consumer to provider. I've put them both in the same project. That's not really a realistic scenario. In a realistic scenario, the consumer and the provider, they are two different parties, two different components, two different services. They probably be in two different code bases. So I've just made it easier for myself and for you to follow along by putting them in the same repository, in the same project even. But in reality, they are different projects, each with their own build and test and deployment cycle. So there is no order between consumer and provider because they are two separate processes. I hope that helps.
We'll see. Yeah, maybe he will add some more details. So I have one more question. If our developers don't want to generate contracts for us, they just deliver microservices according to the specification, and it can happen by many reasons. For example, we are from different team or even from different companies, and we have to create some testing approach there, or maybe create some after tests. So, is any way to automatically generate contract tests according to Swagger's API specification? Or
that is a really good question. Yes, or at least the people behind Pact are working on this. As of now, and what I've seen, what I've shown you, requires both the consumers and the providers to. It takes quite a bit of work, even for this relatively small example, to implement contract testing, and not everybody wants to do that. They say, "Well, we have our tests, we have our mocks, we have our things in place already. Why should I add this?" Or why do you give me all this extra work to implement and to add Pact to that mix too? So the best thing I can do is show you. I'm quickly going to move this away. Bi-directional. Yay, there we go. First hit on.
Before we go deeper, it's time to go to our discussion zone. And as far as I understood, it's Zoom link.
Yes.
Yeah, Zoom link added into our on our platform. And for us, I hope we will have a Zoom link from director or from our guys who support us today, and yeah, we can discuss it there. This and a couple more questions.
Sure.
Thank you.
I'll see you there.
Yeah, thank you for the great talk, and for those who will who will watch this talk after, not in live translation. So. Please send your questions directly to Bas, and I hope he will reply you. Yep.
Yes. If you want to do that, just let me quickly show this slide. Email or LinkedIn are perfect ways to contact me.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all for taking time out of your day to join me in this workshop. I really enjoyed doing this.